Another element that's real critical to any successful implementation of any type of scenario, whether it's using Dynamics 365 for sales management or using Dynamics 365 for customer service, is understanding trends, understanding who your clients are, your customers are, what's happened in the past, how you've gotten to the point that you are, and be able to detect trends and items as easily and as quickly as possible, and leveraging that data to be able to make well-informed business decisions moving forward. You oftentimes hear it from a customer service perspective in being, proactive service. I want to be able to kind of anticipate things before they take place so I can be proactive in the context of my customers. And now, that's done through a variety of different ways. Obviously, being able to use things like the knowledge base gives your technicians or people inside your organization a repository of information to be able to go out and search for kind of past case results, to use those as a measurement tool to be able to solve new cases that are coming in there. The key thing is the more we can leverage that information and the more we can get smart over time. So if we have a mechanism that understands that, based upon this type of case or cases that typically have this type of wording in it, this is typically the knowledge base articles that we use in order to solve that. If we can anticipate what that item is, we now have the ability, when people start entering that information into the application, to let the system recommend or make suggestions on knowledge base articles based upon past experiences, which now gives us more flexibility to be able to see and work with that information more quickly and more efficiently. Same thing when you think about products. If I'm working with products and I have a specific product, there's obviously generally a lot of add-on products that typically get purchased with that particular item, or there might be a bundle of products that typically get purchased. And the only way we ever really know what typically gets purchased with these situations is by tracking past activities and seeing what's happened. And so that's where now Microsoft Dynamics 365 is starting to leverage machine learning to give you that capabilities to start to go out and analyze what's happened in the past based upon what it is that you're doing now, and start to make more proactive recommendations based upon past experiences. So we're not just assuming that we know what is best in this situation, but we're making very calculated decisions. And that's what we want to talk about in this particular module, is kind of the new updated options that are available from a machine learning standpoint. So we're going to look at just some of the different capabilities that are out there and what's available. We're going to talk a little bit about the text analytics piece and how you can use text analytics for Dynamics 365 to do things like knowledge base article recommendation, case topic analysis, looking for similar cases based upon different situations, to be able to analyze the text that's associated with specific records and make suggestions based upon those options. We're going to look at the recommendation engine and how you can use the recommendation engine to build kind of a recommendation model that might be used to facilitate adding or creating or suggesting different products based upon past situations and what's currently attached to that opportunity or that order or that invoice, and now make calculated recommendations based upon those options. And also look at things like document suggestions. Nowadays with Dynamics 365, you have SharePoint, you have OneDrive, you have Office Groups, you have all these other different repositories that can now be integrated into your Dynamics 365 implementation, and each one of those repositories have documents generally sitting out there. And so it's hard sometimes to understand what specific documents might be relevant based upon what it is that you're doing. And so using some of the machine learning and text analytics pieces, we now have the capabilities to trigger document suggestions for people so they have the ability to look at documents that might fit specifically what it is that they're trying to accomplish at that point in time. So we're going to really look at all the different machine learning options that are now available from a Dynamics 365 standpoint. So before we get into the actual machine learning piece inside Dynamics 365, let's just talk a little bit about the basics of machine learning. So when you think about what machine learning actually is it's really about collecting data. So as you go in and you start to use the application and you start to build these repositories of information, you're collecting data. As you add cases to the system, you're collecting data about all the different cases that you've added, the knowledge base articles that were used to solve that particular case, the resolution process that was used to go through that case, every little subtle nuance of what's going through that individual situation. Same thing when you start talking about products. I mean, as you start recommending products and as products are sold to your customers, different products are associated with those items, and that the system builds this collection of data. And so then what starts to happen is with machine learning is it starts to classify and analyze all of that data, and it uses algorithms to start to detect trends. And so it starts to notice that, okay, if I have cases that are associated with, you know, this particular product, or have these particular words in the case title, or have these types of activities associated with them, typically this is the type of knowledge base article that is used to solve that problem, or these are the knowledge base articles that have been used in the past to solve that situation. And so it starts to notice, you know, when I sell, you know, a TV, that if I'm selling a flat screen TV, that I'm probably selling some type of wall mount bracket to go with that. Or if I'm selling a high-end TV, oftentimes there's a speaker system that gets associated with that as well. And it starts to learn these different trends in these items and starts to get intelligent over time, so it can ultimately make predictions. And so it can say, okay, hey, you just added this 65-inch LED TV, or, you know, 4K Ultra TV to this order. Odds are this is going to be the individual products that are going to also be needed to be added to that. You're going to need an HDMI cable. You're going to also want to add surround sound system. You're going to need a TV bracket. Here's some other things that typically have gotten sold with that. So you can be proactive in your predictions. And that's ultimately what we're trying to accomplish from within the Dynamics 365 implementation. So they've built a lot of Azure machine learning information into Dynamics 365. Now, how does it fit? So right now, there's sentiment analysis. So if you think about Microsoft Social Engagement, Microsoft Social Engagement has had sentiment analysis from a machine learning perspective built into it for several different versions. And that sentiment analysis obviously can get exposed inside Dynamics 365 through a variety of different elements, whether it's, you know, using some of the dashboards to facilitate some of that, or associating it directly with kind of a account or a contact record. Now, in addition to that, there are some new analytics and machine learning recommendation options that are now available. Now, before we get into each one of these, a couple of things that I do want to let you know. These are still in preview mode. So these are preview features that are not necessarily shipping as part of the actual application yet. So I do want to suggest that while these are wonderful utilities to use, it's a great opportunity to see how they are going to fit into your deployment types moving forward. They're not necessarily recommended at this point for production environments, but they're definitely features that moving forward are going to be a part of what we're going to be wanting to do from a Dynamics 365 perspective. So it's a good idea to understand exactly how they work. And so that's really what we're going to focus on in this module. And so there's really three pieces to this. There's the text analytics piece, and when we start talking about the text analytics piece, this does a few different scenarios. One of the first things it's going to do is it's going to go out and it does kind of the similar record suggestion. So from like a case perspective, it can go out and it can look at cases that have maybe similar topics or descriptions or different fields that have been, you know, referenced within them based upon activity types. And so as you create a case and you fill in information, it'll understand that we have different cases in the past that might fit into that scope of what it is that you're doing. Same thing with knowledge articles, is it looks and it analyzes different text in different fields, whether it's through that primary record or related record, and it starts to create and suggest knowledge articles based upon those options. I'm sorry, not create, but suggest knowledge articles based upon those options. And then also with topic analysis, is it looks at, you know, all of the different case topics, and it starts to analyze all of those topics and show you what types of topics are being used most often inside the application, so you could use those to drive maybe your decision-making process in regards to additional products or services that you want to sell, items from that nature. It also has product recommendation engine. So there's a product recommendation feature that allows it to recommend products based upon specific functionality. And then it also uses the text analytics piece in addition to some of the other elements that are out there around SharePoint and some of the searching capabilities to do document suggestions. But again, these are all items that are currently in preview, but I want to talk a little bit about how they work. So the first thing that you have to remember is they have to be enabled. So you do have to go into the system, you have to go into settings and administration, and then when you go into system settings, there's a preview tab. And we'll show you this here in a demo in just a couple of seconds. And within that preview, you have to enable the preview features that you want to work with. And so once you turn on the preview features around text analytics and product recommendations, it's then going to give you an option to go out and actually configure them. So one of the first things that you have to understand is this uses kind of Microsoft's new cognitive services, which are their analytical pieces that give you these particular functionalities. And so you do have to then go out and sign up for Microsoft's cognitive service, which has different machine learning API algorithms available for different types of scenarios. There's one specifically around recommendations, there's one specifically around text analytics. Now, one of the nice things that they have is if you want, there's different pricing tiers. And so there's a free pricing tier available that gives you just a certain amount of items that you can use per month, which works perfect from a testing perspective. And it gives you a subscription-based option that you can work with that also assigns you a key that you can use to associate it with your specific environments. And so what I want to do now is just show you how to first kind of opt in and then configure some of these different elements so you can start consuming them inside the application. So if I go into settings and I go into administration, one of the options I'm going to see under administration is system settings. And so when I go over into system settings, I'm going to see a previews tab. And so the first thing I have to do is I really have to opt into the preview features. So there's just a checkbox here that says I've read and I agree to the license terms. You do have to check that. And once you check that, now you have the ability to take advantage of many of the different preview options that are available. This would include some of the organization insights, Cortana integration, as well as the cross-sell product recommendations preview, as well as the text and analytics preview. So what you're going to want to do is just basically set those two items to yes. And by setting those two items to yes, you're now ready to go ahead and start configuring or setting up the services inside the application. Now, the first thing that'll happen is once you've done that and you refresh your browser, if you go back into administration, you're going to see two options. You're going to see one here for Azure Machine Learning Text Analytics, and you're going to see one for Azure Machine Learning Recommendation Services. You have to go in and click on those, and this will allow you to configure the process. And so what ends up happening is it asks you for some individualized information. And this is where you have to subscribe to the Microsoft cognitive services that allow you to go out and facilitate that. So when you go out to the cognitive services website, it'll ask you to sign in, you'll sign in, and then it'll ask you what specific services you want to take a part of. So if you go out to Microsoft.com and then /cognitive services, or if you just do a search for cognitive services, it'll take you out to the cognitive services website where you can sign in using your Office 365 account. And you'll notice that there's different APIs that you can select. And the ones that we're most interested in this particular situation are the text analytics one and the recommendations one. And so when you click on either text analytics or recommendations, it'll bring you to kind of a pricing tier. And so you can go in basically and hit get started for free. And what will happen when you get started for free is it'll bring you into, it'll sign it up, it'll ask you to pick a subscription plan, and it'll give you your different recommendations and text analytics previews. And it'll give you a key, and the key is what's important here. So you can basically copy this key and then bring it into your Dynamics 365 environment. So now what you would do is when you go back into Dynamics 365, you would basically point it to your Cognitive Services Recommendations, and basically it's the URL that you see on this screen here. It's the westusapi.cognitive.microsoft.com/recommendations/version 4.0. Paste in your account key. Then you're going to test your connection, and that's going to go out and just validate that you indeed have an actual key for this particular service and that you have the appropriate Azure service URL associated with it. Once you've tested the connection, then you will have the ability, it'll tell you that it's succeeded, to go ahead and activate the connection. And it does have to be activated in order to start consuming the services. And you're going to want to do that not only for the recommendation service, but also for the text analytics piece as well. So you'll want to go in, you'll supply your information, supply your key, you'll run your test connection, it'll tell you that everything validated okay. You'll then go ahead and hit activate. It'll then activate that, and then it'll allow you to move forward. Now, when you activate it, it also gives you the ability to activate any existing text analytics models. So the next piece to this, and we'll talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail, is you have to go in and create your analytics models for the different components that you want to consume. And so what this is saying is if you've already created those, you can certainly go ahead and have those automatically be activated at the time when you activate the service. So in this case, I could go ahead and activate that information. Now in this case, I'm going to activate it. I'm not going to activate my additional models. I'm just going to activate the service, and then I'll go ahead and build the additional models moving forward. So this is the first critical piece. You have to go into the preview feature. You have to then go ahead and opt in. You have to then go out to the cognitive services. You have to sign up for a free testing account for both the text analytics and or the recommendations piece based upon which ones you want to consume. You then have to supply that connection information into here, supply your key, test your connection, and then activate the services, and then you can start consuming them inside the application. One of the first components that you can use to take advantage of the text analytics piece specifically is similar record suggestions. So if you think about like when you've gone into cases in the past and you've actually worked through cases, there's that option up in the business process flow to recommend or talks about similar cases where you can actually click on that and pick a case that might be similar to the one that you're working with. Well, by using these similar record suggestion rules, we now can use the text analytics piece to actually get more proactive in the items that it's suggested. So it gives you the capabilities to go out and for different entities like the case entity, the opportunity entity, the account entity, to actually go out and build these different similar case suggestion rules. And now these can be used in a variety of different situations. Obviously, when you're going through, the case itself and you want to recommend similar cases or similar opportunities, you have the ability to choose that information inside the application. But this is also when we start talking about things like, document suggestions and some of those items, they use these similar record suggestion rules to facilitate that information moving forward as well. So this is where you can now start to get in and kind of define how you want to search for this information inside the application. So let's just take a look at that real quick. So if I go into settings and I go into data management, so underneath data management down towards the bottom, I will see a similar record suggestion settings. And when I click on similar record suggestion settings, this is what gives me the ability to kind of build this record model that I want to use for suggesting items. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on new. And it's going to ask me, what do I want to call this? So I'm just going to call this similar accounts. Now you'll notice that in here from a similarity standpoint, right now, kind of your core entities are what you can choose from. So there's the account entity, the case, the contact, lead, and opportunity. You can create one of these similarity rules per entity. So once you create one for the account entity, you cannot create any additional ones from an account perspective. So one per entity based upon the items that you see in this drop-down menu. Then what you do is you come down here and you determine whether or not you want to use text analytics or not. So basically, if you think about how it's kind of been done in the past is, inside Dynamics 365, it has kind of its own engine that it uses to estimate different similarities based upon the case record, based upon, topics and keywords and different items. That kind of ships, within the context of the application itself. If you really want to build that on a much more larger scale, this is where you can start to use text analytics to facilitate that. So if I use text analytics, now it's going to use that text analytics engine to actually start building those specific result sets based upon what I want to do. Now, the other thing that I can do is I can also specify, based upon the type of record it is, what result status I want to filter on. So if I only want to look for similar cases that have been resolved, I could do that. Or if I only want to look for similar cases that are currently active, I could do that. Part of that's going to depend upon the type of entity that you're working with. Historically speaking, from a case perspective, depending upon what you might be using it for, there might be many different similar cases that are currently active that you might want to fit into this model. It really depends, and you don't have to put anything in here. It just depends on how granular you want to get with your information. In this case, we'll just go ahead and choose resolved. Then you're going to specify kind of what is the maximum number of key phrases that you want to map. Or match. So it's going to look at, a variety of different phrases or key words that it will be using for matching descriptions. Obviously, the more of these that you have, the longer it's going to take to facilitate these search results. So this is where it also gives you the capabilities to kind of define what you want to use from a target perspective. So in here, I could specify kind of the value that I wanted to work with. In most of these situations, it's between 1 and 1,000. Again, I would use that with a grain of salt. If you're getting much more over 100, now it could potentially cause performance issues moving forward. Now I'm going to save this real quick. And once this is saved, the next thing that you'll notice on this similar record option for similar accounts, and actually I call it similar accounts, but it's actually on the cases. So let's just rename this similar cases here quick. Then it will come down and it will give you the capabilities to start adding some different analytics mappings. Now I'm going to go into one that we've already kind of created here, so I'm going to close out of here real quick. I'm going to open up the opportunity one. And you'll see that I have some options on these match fields that are giving me different matching capabilities. So the first thing that it's doing is it's going out and it's looking for matches on the opportunity entity on the description field. So it's going to be searching the description field for items that will match potential areas inside this opportunity to see if they match. And it uses basically a text match. So if I open this up, it's going in and it's using a text match on the regarding activity description field to determine whether or not that is a similar opportunity based upon that item. It also goes in and does exact matches on the account entity, and so it looks at the activity regarding the account and it pulls that information in. So these are specific fields that I can use to define how I want to match or what fields I want to match from these options. So if I go into similar cases and I go in to add an option here, I can go in and add a new field. Give it 1 second here. Specify what I want to do. So am I looking for kind of a fuzzy text match, or am I looking for an exact match based upon what the entity is that I'm working with? In this case, if I'm doing a text match, then I have the ability to specify different scenarios. So I have case resolution, I have email activities that are regarding this case, I have products that might be associated with this case, I have activities that might be regarding this case, maybe tasks or subjects, or the case itself. So I can look at different elements that might look at these fields and now determine what items I want to search for those particular analytics. So I could look at, the case field, I could look at individual items and now start to really build out my cognitive services in regards to how many different fields it's going to look. So it's going to take all of that information into consideration. So you're just going to build all of these different items, and you can add as many of these as you need based upon how many potential results you want to bring back in. Obviously, remember, the more matching fields that you bring in with the different criterias, the longer it's going to take to search through those. So just be aware of potential performance scenarios that could come into play with that. Once you have all of your items in place, then you can go ahead and you can activate your model. And once you activate your model, then it's going to use that moving forward, and it's going to start to build that repository and learn over time some of the specific elements, and then start making suggested options for those cases based upon those situations. One kind of final thing to mention on this is we talked about the exact match functionality. When you choose exact match functionality, it's going to be looking for an exact match on that particular entity for that specific field that you've defined. And so one of the things that it uses as the determination for that exact match is it uses the quick find fields when you're using the quick find view, or in the indexes that are created for those. So if you want to use a field as an exact match, you do have to define it or enable it as an exact match field, and that's actually done through the quick find settings. So if you go into settings and you go into customizations and you want to customize the system, and then on the entity that you're working with, so like in this case the opportunity entity or whatever particular entity you would be looking at, if you go into that particular entity and you go into the views, you'll want to open up kind of the quick find view, and then you're going to want to go into the find column. So there's an option over on the view here for the add find columns. You go into the find columns, and each field that you want to be used as part of an exact match has to be added here. So as you add those fields, then they will show up in your available options to use as an exact match. And then you can then go ahead and kind of activate your model from there. But the text match, not a big deal, but the exact match, you do have to make sure that the fields that you want to use from an exact match perspective have been added into these areas here, so you can subsequently go in and then reference them as part of the exact match when you're building your model. Another item that you can use to again, kind of get intelligent over time is topic analysis. So if you think about it, all these different cases are going to have topics that are going to be associated with them. And each one of those topics are going to have, different things like defective items. They're going to have keywords that are going to get reported into those individual elements. And so one of the things that the topic analysis allows you to do is to start to analyze all these different case topics over time, and it will start to group together things that are consistently reported across these different topics. And so what you can see in kind of this case topics widget that you get inside the application is the more an item is reported, the more it starts to show up in that view as a more definitive scenario. So it starts off very small, and then as more and more items use that topic, or that gets reported in more and more topics, it starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then ultimately bolded out. And so now, just by a very quick glance from a topic analysis standpoint, I can start to see what are my key topics that are being brought in more often than not as part of the application. And now what's nice about this topic analysis is I can filter this. So I can determine, do I only want to look at cases that were created in the last 6 months? Do I only want to look at cases that meet this specific criteria, based upon, when they were reported or different items that were associated with them? It gives me the ability to really build this model based upon how I want to analyze these topics. And then it runs on a schedule. So I specify, okay, how often I want it to go out and run this topic analysis. And as it runs this topic analysis, it's going to then report that back into the application. And I can even include things like, related items. I can look at descriptions on, different notes that might be added to different items, all these different elements that might be critical to the different topic scenarios that would be brought in. So again, it's about getting kind of intelligent over time. So let's hop in and take a look at this topic analysis piece from inside the application. So this topic analysis is actually done through settings and service management. And so you'll see a few of these different options within service management, but we'll talk specifically about the automatic case topic analysis. So underneath your case settings and record creation update rules option, you'll see an automatic case topic analysis setting. When you click on that case topic analysis setting, this is where you can now start to create the different models that you want to use to analyze the different case topics. And so in here, I'm going to specify, what is the item that I want to work with, or what do I want to call this? I'll just call this sample topic rule. What is the maximum number of topics that I want to, bring in as part of this different situation? So this is where I can kind of define, based upon a number between 1 and 1,000 as far as the number of topics that I want to analyze or bring in as far as this situation goes. I'm going to say, let's say the maximum number of topics we want to do is, we'll say 150 just for sake of purposes. Now, this is case topic analysis, so you'll notice that the source entity in this situation is 100% tied to the case entity. There isn't any real options for associating it with different entities or different items as part of the application. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to save this. And this is going to build my different items that are going to allow me to add different configurations and execution history. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to first go into my model configuration. So this model configuration allows me to kind of define what it is that I want to analyze. So in this case, I'm going to just go ahead and we'll just call this sample. Then I can filter this. So if I only wanted to look at cases that met a certain criteria or a certain time frame, I can open up my filter option in here, and this will now give me a filter window where I could basically build a data filter that would allow me to determine what type of situation I want to look at. So these are the available fields and items that I can look at. And I can also see that if I wanted to bring related records into this as part of this filtering option, this is really just advanced find functionality that I could use to determine how I want to filter these case topics that have come in. So maybe in this case I want to look at created on, and I'm going to say cases that were created on, or let's say cases that were created in the last 4 months. So I only want to look at cases that were created in the last 4 months. So I'm going to click on OK, and it's going to tell me that a filter exists. It's not necessarily going to tell me what the filter is, but if I click on the filter option, then I could go into that specific filter and I could look at it. Now I'm going to look at my time window filter. So as far as how far back do I want to go? Do I want to only look back at the last few days? Do I want to look back at the last few weeks? How far do I want to do this? So I'm going to say I want to look at the last maybe 3 weeks in regards to this option. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit save. And so now what it'll do is kind of like we saw when we were doing the similar suggestion options, now it's going to go out and it's going to add some topic determination fields. So it's going to look at fields that historically would be associated with the topic or work with things. So obviously one of the first options that we would see here would be the case title. So it adds the case title automatically into this particular scenario. It also adds the case description. We'll just open up the case title so you can kind of see what it is. It's very specific. It's what entity do you want to use and what field on that entity do you want to use. So it's going to be looking at that information. So these are ones that historically would make sense from a topic analysis perspective. So it's looking at the case field, it's looking at the description field on any notes that are regarding this particular situation, it's looking at the subject field for any activities that would be associated with this, and then if I switch over to the last one, it's looking at the description field on any of the activities that would be associated. So you get a few different options here in regards to the items that you're going. But again, just like any scenario, if I wanted to add additional topic determination fields here, I certainly could do that. I would just click on the plus sign, add the additional items, and then I could move that information in accordingly. As I've gone through and built kind of my topic determinations, now I can go back into my sample model or my sample topic option that I want to go with, and I can start building the information from there. So we'll give it just a sec to catch up here. As I've gone through and I've added these, and I could add multiple different situations based upon these items that I want to go through, I can then test this. And so what this will do is this will run kind of a sample configuration test, and I'll go out and it'll pull the last 100 options for that configuration test, and it'll just kind of test that new model to see if anything has kind of worked within that item, and it'll create kind of a build execution history. So it'll go through and just kind of test that option and start to build that information as I'm moving forward. That way I can kind of see what results and items that we're getting inside the application. Once I have this ready to go, then I can go ahead and I can set up kind of a build schedule. And so this is where I can determine how often I want this to occur. So do I want this to build kind of, every day? Do I want this to build weekly? How often do I want this to build and at what time? Because again, the more it builds and the more times it's going through and kind of recommending this information, the more of these topics that you're going to have at your disposal when you go in and start looking at the topic analysis piece. So again, you'll want to build your schedule accordingly based upon that situation. So we'll say daily. We'll run it every day, and we'll start it today at 9 a.m. Actually, let's just start it tomorrow at 9 a.m. And then once I'm done with this, then I can go ahead and activate the model, and then I can start to see these topic analysis inside the system. Now, the big thing to remember with any type of machine learning or any type of analytics that are going to take place, this is something that it gets intelligent over time. It builds this information up over time. So just by simply going in and configuring a few of these pieces doesn't mean that you're magically going to have all this information inside your application today. It's going to take some time. So if we're building it every day, it's going to take several days of cases coming into the application before you're going to start to get information populating. However, once you've let it run for a little while, if you then go into services and you go into cases, if you go into the charts area, you're actually going to see a chart called case topics. And when you go into your case topics, this will give you that visualization that I showed you on the main screen. Now again, we just configured this, we just built the schedule, so it's not necessarily going to display anything in here yet. But as we start to do more and more of this, and as we add more cases into it, you'll start to see data populate into here. And again, the more items and topics are being notified, the more you're going to see them, the larger they'll appear and eventually be bolded inside the application. But this is a great way that you can now just start to look at some of the different trends that are taking place inside the application. If you've used Dynamics 365 for a while, you've probably at some point in time used knowledge articles. And the knowledge article piece is very cool because it gives you kind of that searching the knowledge base functionality where, let's just say, for example, you're on a case. You go into a case, you click on a case, you now want to look at related knowledge base articles. So when you do a knowledge search for the related articles, it typically goes in and it takes the case title, kind of feeds that into the search criteria, and then uses that case title to determine whether or not there's any matching knowledge base articles in the system. Now, the nice thing with the text analytics piece is we can take that to the next level. So now we can actually start to search knowledge articles, and we can start looking for knowledge articles based upon text analytics using the same types of criteria that we've looked at, for the similar cases as well as for the topic analysis. Now, this is typically something that you're only going to do with entities that have been enabled for knowledge management. So, out of the box, it's going to be the case entity, but you could go in from an account perspective, and you could go in and enable account for knowledge-based searches, and then you would have the ability to build kind of these analytic pieces around the account piece. And so what ends up happening then is you can use this model to actually do knowledge-based suggestions instead of having to do it just off of the topic. So again, over time, it's going to do more of the fuzzy match situations where it's going to start to analyze multiple areas, and it's going to start to offer suggestions based upon all those different fields that it's analyzed inside the application. So let's just go ahead and take a look at the knowledge base option search capabilities inside the application. So again, this is under the service management piece. So if I go into settings and I go into service management, and this is considered part of the knowledge base management. So if I go down to knowledge management, I'll see my embedded knowledge search in my categories, but I'll also see a knowledge search field setting. So if I click on knowledge search field settings, this is where I can go ahead and open up or kind of create my item that I want to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new option. I'm going to just call this sample recommendations. Now again, I only have case entity here because this is the only option that I've currently enabled for knowledge search. If I go in and enable, the contact entity or the account entity or any of these other situations, I would then have those options available. In this case, we'll just go ahead and leave it at the case entity. We'll specify how many key phrases we want to work with. So depending upon, what the situation is, again, you can specify that growing number. But again, remember, the more you specify within that option, the longer it's going to take to search through that. Not that you're going to have a ton of performance implications, but it's still something to kind of consider. So now I'm going to hit save. And now it's going to go out just like we've done in the past, and it's going to say, okay, I need to know what fields we want to map in order to do these searches. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add an analytics entity mapping. I'm going to specify what field I want to look at. So obviously, first one would probably be case. And within the case, I would want to look at the case title because that's obviously probably going to have some of that baseline information in there. So I'll save and close on that option. Then I'll go into my next option. I'll add another one, again, probably on the case entity again. Another one that we oftentimes will have some of that information in there is the description. So I'll add and save and close the description. And then I would just keep going. So if I know that I have activities that oftentimes would have some of these analytic pieces in it, I could go into the regarding activity, and maybe within the regarding activity, I'm going to have the subject on the regarding activity or maybe the description. So I would just continue to kind of build this as much as I would want to have within the context of that item. So again, the more options you add in here, the more options it's going to have available to you when you're moving forward. As you build this, then just like any of these analytic pieces, you then have to activate the process. Once you activate it, now it's ready for you to start consuming. Now it's a little different from a consuming perspective because at this point we still have the knowledge article suggestions being done from the kind of case topic situation. And so now we would have to go in and actually modify the forms on the case to facilitate how we want to use this information. So we activate the model. Now we can go into settings. We can go into customizations, customize the system. And again, we're going to do this on the case entity. So I'm going to go into entities. I'm going to go into the case entity. I'm going to look at the forms on the case entity. And I really have, typically when I'm looking at the case entity, I have two forms that I typically need to modify from within the case entity. I have the standard case form, and then I also have the case interactive form for the interactive service hub. Both of those are exposing kind of that knowledge search functionality. So from the case perspective, if I go onto the case form and I open that up, my knowledge search functionality is typically a part of kind of my tab control information that I would be looking at from that standpoint. So if I go into my case information, or I go into my associated knowledge records option, actually let me go here into my conversation. If I go into knowledge-based search, so in here I have turn on automatic suggestions. And so right now it's giving suggestions based upon a field value, and it's using the case title in order to kind of facilitate that. What I could do now is I could come into here and use text analytics. And by using text analytics, this is now going to use that model that I have defined specifically for this case entity to actually start making those suggestions. So instead of just making the recommendations based upon the case title, it's now going to make those recommendation suggestions based upon my text analytics. So now I would save and close this form, publish my customizations, and now those items would start to be utilized inside the searching controls of the knowledge articles. And I would also do the same thing for the interactive experience. So I would open up the interactive experience form, and then from the interactive experience form, I have my knowledge article functionality that I would be looking at in my knowledge search sections. So I would go into here. Actually, I have to unlock this first. So I go into my related section. I unlock the section. Then I go into my knowledge functionality, go down to the same thing, turn on automatic suggestions, switch that to text analytics, and then this will start consuming that inside the application. Save and close, publish my customizations, and now I'm using that text analytics piece based upon whatever recommendation model that I've defined to make those suggestions. Up until this point, everything we've talked about has been really more focused on the text analytics piece. And so it's using that text analytics API to build those models and to analyze the text as it's being entered into the application. Now, if you remember, when we first went in and we enabled the preview functionality, one of the other features that we turned on was the product recommendations. And that used the recommendations API to actually go out and start recommending products based upon different algorithms and different situations. And so that's the final piece to this that we want to talk a little bit about, is the product recommendations. And so as you're selling your products, the system's going to start to learn, or you're going to learn over time, there's different baskets of products that we sell. We have a lot of different products that we group together that when they get sold, they typically get sold kind of on the same order. We also have a lot of times when users order specific products, typically there's other products that they order in addition to that option. And so the product recommendations now can look at things like products that are associated to opportunities, the products or the quote detail, the products that are associated with quotes and orders and invoices, or if you have a custom entity that has custom line items, or anything that really has kind of a relationship with products, it can start to look at those individual products and start to make product-based recommendations based upon those items. Now this, when you create kind of your product recommendation learning model, and then it starts to make suggestions based upon those items. So now, for example, there's really two ways that it factors in recommendations. It factors them based upon kind of basket data, and it recommends them based upon recommendation data. So from a basket data standpoint, if you think about it kind of in the terms of a shopping cart, it looks at the items that are typically put into the same shopping cart. So, if you're out on Amazon or if you're out on some type of purchasing service, it's going to look at the items that typically get put together in the same shopping cart or in the same basket that would typically be used to sell those products together. So again, you could make a recommendation based upon those options. The other one would be the recommendation entity, where it looks more at kind of past user purchases, and it looks to see who's purchased what particular items together, and it starts to build those recommendation models based upon those options. So this now gives you a little bit more flexibility to start expanding out what those items and those products look like. So now this time, if I go into settings and I go back into and actually go to the product catalog, I will see a product recommendations option. So when I click on product recommendations, this is going to open up my product recommendation model. And so this is the model that kind of defines the different product recommendation capabilities that I want to work with. And so what it starts to do is it looks at different situations. So it looks at the number of recommendations that it's going to make. It looks at kind of the minimum rating. So it looks at the recommendation rating based upon how things are brought in. It looks at the product catalog cross-selling link. So it uses numeric values to determine the product catalog. And then it looks at your basket data and your recommendation options. And so what it basically does is, for each one of these items, I can go in and I can add specific items. And so within this situation, I can look at the opportunity, and I can look at the account that it's being associated with, and I can look at the opportunity products, and then I can look at kind of existing products that are being brought into that. And this is where I can now start to filter specific products. So I can filter items based upon different categories. So this is now going to start to look at when specific products were, when the opportunity was won, and when the products were actually won within the last specified period of time. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at kind of past situations where these opportunities and these orders have had different fields associated with them. So I'm looking at, for potential customers, for orders, I'm looking at products that were on the orders. I'm looking at products that were on the quote. So I'm building how I want to associate this information based upon those options. Then what I do is I come down into the recommended entities and I do the same type of situation. So it goes into the recommendation entities and it does the same type of option. So it looks at items where opportunities were created, it looks at the opportunity products, and it looks at existing opportunity products. And then based upon those items, it will start to make recommendations. So then what I can do is I can build this model version based upon what I have in here at this point, and it will start to build these different recommendation versions. And then I have the ability to actually go out and test these based upon these different models. So I can pick a specific product in the system. I can then pick a model version. And then as I go in and pick a model version, as these model versions have been built and published out, it'll then start to show me those recommendations. Now again, this is machine learning, so it takes a little bit of time for these algorithms and things to populate. So as you're first creating these, you may not see things initially. Once you build these items, then you can go ahead and activate this, and then it will start making product recommendations. So when you go into the system, you pick a product, you can go into suggestions, it'll then make suggestions based upon those options. Now it currently has the suggestion models built into place, but you have to build those, and so it requires kind of an administrator to understand what that process looks like. By bringing this situation in, you now have the ability to build it on a much larger scale and then start to constitute out what specifically you want to do from there. As you saw with the recommendation options, we can take recommendations and do them based upon opportunities. We can do them based upon orders, invoices. There's a lot of different options. The only real thing to remember is from a mobility perspective. If you are going to use recommendations and you have people who are going to be using the mobile application, right now only the opportunity entity is available from a mobile perspective. So from a recommendation standpoint, it will only do recommendations if you're using the opportunity entity, and it will not do recommendations if you're working offline. So you do have to be online and on the opportunity entity, and then it will do product recommendations and suggestions on mobile. Otherwise, only the web client will really allow you to do kind of the full-on recommendations based upon opportunity, quote, order, invoice, the typical entities that you would suspect to have product recommendations associated with. So the final piece to the machine learning concept is document suggestions. So you think about it, there's a lot of different places now that we can store documents as it pertains to Dynamics 365. I can have a SharePoint site that has a bunch of document libraries associated with it that we might have access to based upon the account, case, or lead. We might have a OneDrive that has a bunch of sites and documents associated with it. Office groups, we can install the Office Group solution, and now we start creating and adding documents into there. So and even an external URL. So there's all these different kind of storage areas that all these documents might pertain to. So one of the things you can do with the application for document suggestions is you can turn on document suggestions for the contact, opportunity, lead, account or case entity, or custom entities. And when you turn on the document suggestions, what it will do is it will actually go out and search all of these different locations. So it'll look at the default SharePoint site, and then it'll go out to other SharePoint sites, and then it'll go out to OneDrive, and then Office Groups, and then external URLs. But it'll only search the locations in the documents that the user that's currently logged into the system has access to. And then based upon those items, it'll start making suggestions that you can use within those. Now, document suggestions isn't quite like some of the other items that we've talked about where you just kind of create the algorithm and then off you go. It's really a culmination of a bunch of different features that are kind of enabled and turned on from inside the application. So if you're going to use document suggestions, obviously the first thing is you have to be on a Dynamics 365 online subscription. So it is not supported for on-premises or on-premise deployments at this point. The other situation is if you wanted to search SharePoint, you do have to have access to SharePoint Online, SharePoint 2013 or SharePoint 2016, and you do have to have SharePoint document management set up inside Dynamics 365. So you do have to go through the server-side synchronization for SharePoint, set that up, and enable that functionality. You also have to have relevant search turned on. So you do have to go in and enable and configure relevant search for all the different entities that you want to use and potentially suggest documents for. So relevant search does have to be turned on and enabled. Then you actually have to go in and use text analytics. So you have to enable text analytics and turn on text analytics and set that up and configure just like we've been doing to this point. And then for each entity that you want to use in the document suggestions, you have to create those similarity rules. So you have to go in for the account, the contact, and just like we kind of did at the beginning, you have to configure all of those individual situations. So if you want to use document suggestions, you certainly can do that. It's just a matter of making sure that you have Dynamics 365 online, that you've connected to SharePoint if you want to use SharePoint, that you have set up document management in SharePoint with Dynamics 365, you've enabled relevant search, you've turned on text analytics, and then you've created similarity rules for each particular entity that you want to work with, and then it will start to make document suggestions based upon those individual scenarios. So finding ways to be proactive in regards to all the different elements that you offer from within your Dynamics 365 subscription are always kind of a critical aspect. Looking at the products and services that you sell and finding ways to be proactive in how you recommend products and services to people based upon past purchasing situations and past purchasing requirements that people have done. Looking at suggesting knowledge base articles. These are all things that with machine learning you now have the ability to bring up to the next level. Now again, as we mentioned at the top of the module, these are all preview features, so these are not necessarily not necessarily that you need to use or that you should be using them in a production environment. Think of these more as testing, flexibility, building up the feature subset so you understand specifically how all this information is going to work moving forward, so when we are ready to actually do official releases on these items, you kind of have an understanding as to what's going to work. Now obviously with any preview feature, things may change subtly as the product matures a little bit, but the overall functionality on how they're going to act and react inside the system are there. So in this module, we really just talked a little bit about just what is machine learning in general and how can Azure Machine Learning be leveraged inside Dynamics 365 to really make the suggestions and the recommendations on the different entities more specific and more targeted based upon what you want to do. We talked a little bit about text analytics, and we talked about how turning on text analytics gives you the capabilities to utilize that functionality to make better, more targeted knowledge article recommendations, to analyze some of the different topics that are inside your cases and see what trends are in regards to those options, to use that to suggest records that based upon different settings and different items for cases and items. And also we looked at like your document suggestions and how you can use document suggestions to actually go out and search different repositories where you store documents associated with your Dynamics 365 incidents and actually go out and make recommendations based upon those options. And then finally we talked about product recommendations and how the recommendations API can be used to better recommend more targeted specific products based upon items that might be normally purchased together or historically have been bought together when people make purchases. But either way, machine learning is definitely the next step. When you start thinking about, how I want to be more proactive in regards to servicing my customers, machine learning is what's going to start bringing you forward within those scenarios. So I would definitely recommend that even though a lot of these are still in preview, it's still worthwhile to bring it into a dev or a test environment and just kind of give it a once over and just see where this can fit into the grand scheme of what you want to do moving forward in delivering solutions for your customers.